Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is the Great Debate. And we're fortunate to have with us to talk about the Great Debate, Professor Dr. AAl-Hadid, formerly from Tennessee State University. And of course, Dr. AAl-Hadid, you've been with us many, many times. And I think that for most of our audience, you really need no introduction, literally. But in case there might be a few people who might not have seen you within this context before, let's have you to give us some information about your background, your education, and some of the experiences before becoming involved with the topic, the Great Debate this morning. Then we'll talk about, by the end of at that time, it should be time for the first commercial break, and then we'll get into the second segment dealing almost exclusively with the Great Debate, as well as that last 10-minute segment. Let's do it from that perspective.
Well, I would like to start with the idea that I'm originally from Montgomery, Alabama, and my consciousness in terms of becoming aware of social issues and culture came about by participating in the civil rights movement there in Montgomery. I came of age between the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 and the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965. And it was through that experience that I came to understand injustice. I came to understand the nature of the struggle. In fact, it led me to understanding how you take basic Christian principles and apply them to social change when I was a student there at Alabama State. I left Alabama State and went out on the West Coast, and that took me to another level. At that point, I became in contact more with people, nationalistic thinking and more Islamic thinking. So out of that experience, I moved over and became Muslim. I was a missionary Baptist and I became Muslim. Went to Africa, traveled extensively through Africa, mainly in Kenya, East Africa, Nigeria and West Africa and some other countries. And I made the pilgrimage to Mecca in 1969 and finished my doctorate, came to Tennessee State in 73. And I stayed at TSU for 35 years. And then I did a brief period as a principal of a local Islamic school, the Nashville International Academy. And so that's pretty much my academic and activist resume.
So in the real sense, Dr. AAl-Hadid, you've been involved in some way, one way or the other, dealing with civil rights, the activities involved in human rights and et cetera, almost all of your life. Is that right?
Yeah, I was born and bred and struggled
with that. And I think, as you said, between what the bus boycott,
Montgomery bus boycott,
the
55,
Selma in 65,
65, right.
That decade, which was a powerful decade in the history of the United States, not only in the history of black folks in the United States, but in the history of the United States in a real sense, especially dealing with the suffrage. And I think that that's still one of the most important things that we can talk about today, and we'll have an opportunity to talk about that. But in a real sense, this is basically what we wanted to do, to sort of get that information. And as we said, you've been with us on many, many occasions, and each time we get the same kind of basic information, but there are some other things that we really didn't pull out during that first time. And so you made the whole round in a real sense. And we're certainly delighted to have you here to talk about what we consider to be one of the most important topics, and that's the Great Debate. We've got about a minute and a half before this segment ends. Why don't you sort of give us an overview of what do we mean really when we talk about the Great Debate?
Well, as we defined it at Tennessee State, the Great Debate is a culture and intellectual forum within which we debated contemporary social issues. The goal was to try to find a synthesis between the philosophies and the theology of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and try to find where they came together in common unity and harmony. Because historically, a lot of people felt that they were so different that they didn't have anything in common, but as they progressed in the struggle, you find that they start to converge and they came closer together. So our goal in the Great Debate was try to figure out how can you unify these two philosophies, these two theologies, and then apply those principles to contemporary social issues.
And you've also, I think, started to apply the Great Debate to individuals or various personalities, because I recall that at one time we did a great debate on the President Barack Obama, and the Great Debate. And I think that that was one of the most popular shows that we've had dealing with President Obama and the Great Debate. Right. And so what we're going to do, we're going to take our first commercial break, excuse me, and then we'll come back and we'll pick up at that time, beginning with the Great Debate. Mm-hmm. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial. Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for the morning. We're talking to Dr. Al-Hadid, who is a retired professor from Tennessee State University, and he's given us some information in reference to the Great Debate. Professor Al-Hadid, let's see if we can pick up where we left off during the first segment and have you to start talking about the Great Debate itself. Mm-hmm.
I like to put the Great Debate in some historical context. I see it in three stages. One is what I would call the archetypical Great Debate, and that was the tension between those leaders, primarily who were doing slavery, who wanted to repatriate back to Africa, and then another group of people who wanted to assimilate into American society. So out of those who wanted to repatriate, you got the establishment of the country of Liberia on about the time of the Civil War. And for those that wanted to repatriate after the American Revolution, you got the establishment of Sierra Leone. Mm-hmm. So there were actually two colonies established from ex-slaves from America, Sierra Leone during the period of the American Revolution, and then you had Liberia during the period of the Civil War. And you had other people who felt that they didn't leave anything in Africa, didn't want to go back. So they would say, as soon as we're free, we're going to assimilate into America. Well, when slavery ended, in 1865, there was the illusion of assimilation, but the reality of Jim Crow. So out of that dialectic came another great debate, and that great debate was between what we might call separation and integration. And you had people who wanted to take those positions. And this one I would call the prototypical great debate. And that was the great debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois.
Most of us know that debate.
That's the most familiar one. Du Bois was, and they both dealt with educational institutions. Du Bois pushed a liberal arts agenda for the private schools, because he was a graduate of Fisk University. And Booker T. Washington pushed more or less an agenda of self-determination. Lifting yourself up by your own bootstraps. And he developed it based on the A&I model, agricultural and industrial. So out of that came, out of his vision came a lot of your land grant schools like Tennessee State University, Arkansas A&M, Florida A&M, and so forth. So Booker T. Washington's philosophy was more of a land grant philosophy, where development was based on the land and agriculture, and Du Bois's philosophy was more liberal arts. And so he wanted people to become scholars, intellectuals, and study the classics. And so they clashed, you know, and Du Bois is probably best known for his role in being one of the founders of the NAACP, and then later on being a person who created the early Pan-African movements. He did 5 Pan-African movements, so he went from the assimilation with NAACP, then he became a Pan-Africanist, a socialist, and finally he left the country and repatriated himself to Ghana, where he was a guest there of Kwame Nkrumah, the first African head of state there in Ghana. Now, of course, with Booker T. Washington's legacy, which was one of economic self-sufficiency and economic self-determination, his argument was picked up by Marcus Garvey. As a matter of fact, when Garvey came from Jamaica, he said that of all of the leaders in America, Booker T. Washington was the only one that had any sense, because he was the one who was trying to understand white supremacy and apartheid the way it was. So Garvey picked it up in 1916, and then he got accused of mail fraud and was put in prison in Atlanta. But before that happened, he organized one of the largest movements in the history of our people. I think he mobilized about 6 million people as a part of his organization, Universal Negro Improvement Association. When Garvey was taken off the scene in 1928, on the heels of Garvey came another man actually two people. One was Noble Drew Ali with the Moorish Science Temple, and then the other one was Farad Muhammad, who came in 1930. And so what they did, you went from Booker T. Washington to Marcus Garvey, and from that, then the Islamic nationalism came out in those two movements, the Moorish Science Temple, Noble Drew Ali, and then the Nation of Islam with Farad Muhammad, and later Elijah Muhammad, who picked it up from Farad Muhammad.
That's interesting.
Yes, and then of course with the civil rights movement, then out of that came, you know, Martin Luther King and A. Philip Randolph with the Pulling the Cars Porter. So you had these two movements, and eventually we come to the point where Malcolm and Martin come on the scene in the mid 1950s. Malcolm being associated with his Mosque No. 7 in Harlem, and Martin Luther King coming on the stage at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, and then later he went to Ebenezer there in Atlanta. So when those two men came on the scene, the gap between the two was getting narrower and smaller. So we started out with the two extremes, either assimilate here as a domestic strategy or repatriate back to Africa. Most people didn't want that. So now you deal with integration versus separation. And then in the case of Martin and Malcolm, it was separation versus integration. But Elijah Muhammad was not like Marcus Garvey. He did not necessarily want to go back to Africa. He was pushing more an idea of reparations. He wanted the United States government to give African Americans some arable states in the South mainly, 2 or 3 states, so that it could develop a nation within a nation. Of course, that was utopian thinking because, you know, a civil war was fought when the Southerners broke away from the Union, but that, you know, never happened. So he was pushing a philosophy of reparation for the pain and suffering of slavery, separation from whites because they didn't want to integrate, and then self-determination, economic self-determination. So he was more or less embraced Booker T. Washington economic agenda. When Martin Luther King came along, the dominant civil rights movement was the NAACP, and of course A. Philip Randolph with the labor movement, the Pullman Car Porters. And so you had a labor agenda with A. Philip Randolph, and then you had Rel Wilkins with the NAACP, but their battle was mainly in the courts. It was when Martin Luther King came along that the fight was actually taken to the streets, and they embraced the philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi. So King's philosophy was that Christ provided the spirit in terms of a Christian liberation theology, and Gandhi provided the method. So now you have Christian Gandhian concept inside America, and then you also have the dialectics of the Islamic nationalists. So that's the real clash between Malcolm and Martin. And that's
in a real sense, I think, excuse me, in a real sense, I think that this sort of will lead us into the last segment of this particular show, and then you're going to get into an individual or individuals that will bring us in a different situation, and et cetera, I would imagine.
Yeah, I want to talk about how ultimately they were on the same page in the finishing session.
Very good. Because, and of course, let us take this second commercial break, and we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to the third segment of the show for the morning. We're talking to Dr. AAl-Hadid, formerly from Tennessee State University, and a professor dealing with just a whole variety of information dealing with the African experience in the United States. And of course, Doctor, let us see if we can pick up where we left off during this second segment, and to have you to talk about for the next 10 minutes, 8 to 10 minutes, some of the things that come out of the great debates, and to sort of finish that out for us.
Yeah, you know, we talk about the great debate as a dialectical project. We usually present Dr. King as the thesis of integration, and Malcolm or El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz as the antithesis. So that's where your conflict come in. And so what I want to do now is to thrash out a synthesis of that thesis and antithesis. So when we try to synthesize King and Malcolm, we have to understand that the zeitgeist, or the spirit of the time, some call it the forces of history. You know, history is animated by a spirit. And those events and dates and so forth are animated by a spirit. And this zeitgeist, or the spirit of the times, had tracked both Malcolm and Martin down. They were great men, and they were inspired great men. They had taken vows of poverty. They didn't have life insurance. They were totally committed to the movement because there was a cause bigger than themselves. And I think the mountaintop experience for both men, when Martin Luther King went to Oslo, Norway in 1964, December of 64, where he received the Nobel Peace Prize. And then, of course, he made a pilgrimage to India. So this gave him a global view. Now, with Malcolm in 64, he had a similar experience. In April of 64, he made the pilgrimage to Mecca. Then he traveled extensively throughout Africa and the Middle East. So Malcolm's pilgrimage to Mecca and his travels throughout Africa, and then King's Nobel Peace Prize and his travel in India. And he also made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, where he made his Christian pilgrimage. So by both of them going outside of America and looking at our problem, that is the problem, African American, as a global problem, they both moved to the position of human rights. So King shifted from an exclusive focus on human rights to a focus on, on civil rights to a focus on human rights. Malcolm shifted from a focus on separation to a focus on human rights. So I think toward the end, in the 60s, Malcolm was assassinated February 21st, 1965, but in 64, they both agreed on the question of human rights. Malcolm's project in the last days was to go to the newly free African countries and try to get those heads of states to join him in a coalition of conscience to bring the United States government before the World Court accusing it of genocide. So he wanted to file a petition to the United Nations. It wasn't anything new because Paul Robeson had done that. Marcus Garvey attempted to bring a petition to the World Court in the United Nations. But here again, the focus is on human rights. So then when you look at Martin, in 64, two things have happened for Martin. One is he's completed the Montgomery campaign and got a victory there in 55, 56. And then, of course, the 1964 Civil Rights Act has been passed. That was his campaign in Birmingham. So at this point, he's moving now toward his Selma campaign, which was in 65, in the spring of 1965. But here again, you see him moving toward going from protests to politics in terms of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You also see him moving toward the dialectics between labor and capital. And that's what ultimately the movement in Memphis was all about with the sanitation workers. This was
That's what got him assassinated.
That's what got him taken off the stage, with that issue. And of course, Malcolm got taken off because of his efforts to bring charges of genocide against the United States government. King also was looking at the triple evils of racism, war, because he ultimately took a position against the war in Vietnam in April of 67. He was assassinated in April of 68. And then also the issue of poverty. So he was trying to meet Johnson halfway because, Johnson had this war on poverty and the anti-poverty program. So that was his connection with Johnson in terms of dealing with the question of poverty. So in this case, you're seeing both of them dealing with the human rights issue. Another thing that you're starting to see now is that both of them became internationalists. Not simply because King had the Nobel Peace Prize or because Malcolm made the pilgrimage to Mecca, but because they're starting to see international solutions as a way of solving the problem of African Americans out of the United States. So what they were both saying is that the problem at that time, there were 22 million African Americans, said this problem is not just a local, regional, or domestic or national problem. This is a global problem. So wherever people of color are on the world stage today, they're having the same problems, dealing with poverty, dealing with colonization outside of Africa and segregation inside of America, and then also dealing with the question of war, because this whole war machine, the military-industrial complex, was impacting the whole of the global economy, not just African Americans who were fighting that war, or Americans who were fighting that war, all over the planet. You know, you had this, at that time you're dealing with the Cold War. You had Russia and China lined up against the United States, England, France, and so forth. This is the aftermath of the Second World War. So they were both trying to understand the struggle within the context of the Cold War. Prior to this, you know, you had the Bandung Conference in 1954, where the newly independent African heads of states and Asian heads of state met in Jakarta, Indonesia. And they were looking at a third world strategy, a third world solution to the problems that they were having in Asia, the problem they were having in Africa. And as Malcolm pointed out in his message, his grassroots speech, the only people that were not allowed to come to the Bandung Conference was the white man, people from Europe, because they were the former colonial masters, and inside of the United States, you know, was a slave master. So I think in that context, King and Malcolm were coming together. Now, in terms of the dialogue itself, there were two attempts. One is when King and Malcolm met in the Congress in 1964, when they were debating the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It was just like a Kodak moment or a cameo. They didn't really talk much because they didn't have time, but there's a picture where they came together and they greeted each other, and I think at that point, they both realized, when you see it in that picture, they both knew that they were marked men, that they had made a choice in life that was irreversible, and if they kept going down that path, then they were going to become martyrs. I think they both realized it when they came together at that point.
Not only, excuse me, did they realize that, but I think the entire American, especially the entire black American culture understood that what was the only thing that could come out of what they were saying would be their deaths. Yeah, I think that was quite, that was understood, and that even though they were tragic events, both deaths, that all of us probably said they were not, surprised. Why? Because, you know, everything was sort of leading that way. They were the martyrs of the cause in a real sense.
Yes, and then with King coming to that realization, he started. You notice some of his speeches. In fact, one time he actually gave his eulogy at one point. But then when you hear him in Memphis when he's saying, you know, I've been to the mountaintop. And I've looked over. I might not live to see the promised land with you, but I know that we are the people who make it to the promised land. And so I see that in the sense of, you know, throughout King's career, he was more or less a Christ archetype. He followed, you know, the path of Christ. But toward the end, he became more like Moses. Because this is Moses now, who's on Mount Sinai to get the Ten Commandments, looking across the Jordan River and seeing Canaan.
He had in reality reached that point as far as his international reputation was concerned. I think you indicated the World Peace Prize and all of that. Everybody believed him to be, in a real sense, that individual.
Right. And Malcolm would always say, you know, people would ask him, "Are you afraid for your life?" He said, "I'm already a dead man. I live every day like I'm a dead man." You know. And he said the price of freedom is death.
Let me thank you, Dr. Al-Hadid, for bringing by that excellent information. And let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning. Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is Dr. Martin L. King and the beloved community. And we're fortunate to have with us to talk about Dr. King and the beloved community, Dr. Lewis Baldwin, formerly of Vanderbilt University and now a person that has so much information, has written so many books, and has a lot of information for the entire community. And Dr. Baldwin, let me thank you, first of all, for coming by and being with us.